Declaro abierta.
The 9,520th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Egypt and Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/1029, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United Arab Emirates. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I will now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, last week a group of Security Council members travelled to the Rafah border. We saw firsthand the dire challenges that we have been discussing in this chamber for over 2 months now, and we met victims who endured and survived the hell unleashed on Gaza following the October 7th attacks on Israel. I will never forget meeting Mohammed, a boy almost the same age as my son Laith. Like countless other children, he was recovering at the El Arish hospital from wounds caused by an Israeli airstrike. He told me he just wanted to go home and see his parents, and it was heartbreaking to hear from hospital staff that he had no idea that the strike that had wounded him had also killed every single member of his family. The situation Council members saw at the Rafah border is unbearable. Thousands of trucks trying and failing to enter through a choke point, a crossing that was only ever intended to be for pedestrians. Nearly 1 million people are crammed into an area at the Rafah border in Gaza, where before the war there were less than 300,000. According to the World Food Programme, the food that has entered into Gaza since the beginning of the conflict is only 10% of what is necessary to sustain the population. Half of the people of Gaza are now starving. The UN has reported that the proportion of people hungry in Gaza is higher than any country in any conflict in the last 20 years. Given the desperate situation I have just described, that is being detailed by the Secretary General to all UN agencies, things cannot possibly get any worse. Let's be clear, in the coming period, unless we take drastic action, there will be famine in Gaza. This war and the unbearable price being paid by Palestinian civilians, 60–70% of whom we know are women and children, is also having a significant impact on neighboring countries. Regional spillover is a real possibility. We are seeing it already, including in the West Bank, where almost 300 Palestinians, including 75 children, have been killed. Egypt's efforts to mitigate this crisis on its border are admirable, but it needs help. This is not Egypt's problem alone. There must be an international response, and this is why the Security Council has been asked to urgently step in. The text is the product of extensive consultations and engagement between members of this Council and concerned parties, in particular Egypt and Palestine, for whose efforts we are especially grateful. The purpose of this text is very simple. It responds with action to the dire humanitarian situation on the ground for the Palestinian people, bearing the brunt of this conflict, while protecting those who are trying to deliver life-saving aid. And it demands the urgent release of the hostages and for humanitarian access to address their medical needs. The draft reaffirms that we are building on the important Resolution 2712 and its provisions. It demands that the parties to the conflict allow and facilitate the use of all available routes to the Gaza Strip for the provision of humanitarian assistance. What this means is that all possible land, sea, and air routes into Gaza must be utilized to allow life-saving aid to enter. This includes ensuring that the Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salim crossing remains open in full with this Council's backing. But even if trucks are going in at scale, if deconfliction does not happen, aid simply cannot reach those who need it. Current deconfliction efforts are clearly not working if 136 UN workers have lost their lives because of it. This is why the text reaffirms that UN and humanitarian personnel, premises, and consignments are protected and must not be attacked, a vital principle of international humanitarian law that has been repeatedly violated in this conflict. The text also calls for urgent steps to allow unhindered and critically expanded humanitarian access, and it also calls on the parties to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. We know this is not a perfect text. We know only a ceasefire will end this suffering, and that is why the UAE put a resolution to the vote in this Council on Friday, 8th December. Unfortunately, it failed to pass. On 12th December, 153 countries called for this in the General Assembly. Again, a ceasefire did not happen as a result of this call, although its significance in its moral clarity is clear. The resolution the UAE has put in blue this morning responds to the calls for a sustainable cessation of hostilities and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid. Often, in diplomacy, the challenge is meeting the moment in the world we live in, not in the world that we want, and we will never tire in pushing for a full humanitarian ceasefire. The resolution tasks the Secretary-General with appointing a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator. Their mandate will be to monitor, verify, and facilitate humanitarian relief to Gaza, and the resolution gives them the necessary resources and equipment to do so. And the coordinator will establish a mechanism for accelerating the delivery of aid, and we expect the initial report on its work within 20 days. We have established similar mechanisms in other humanitarian crises. We are watching scenes on our screens in recent weeks, civilians desperately scrambling in Gaza over basic necessities to live. That should be an alarm bell of a breakdown of civil order in Gaza. Not only is this morally abhorrent, it is not in anyone's interest and could spiral unless we address it head-on. Mr. President, many governments, including those represented at this table, have made tremendous efforts to send aid, funds, and advance negotiations around hostages. But until we pool efforts for an international response, we will not be able to manage this crisis sustainably. If the current situation continues over the next few days, while we are safe at home with our loved ones during the festive period, civilians in Gaza will be dying either from military strikes or the secondary impacts of war, hunger, disease, and widespread infection. This Council has a responsibility to ensure that they are not victimized twice over. We have extensively negotiated and tried to find language that meets everyone's concerns, but also addresses this challenge with a practical response. I'd like to thank each and every Council member who has contributed to this text and improved it, and I'd like to thank the United States for their complete engagement in trying to find a resolution that meets the moment. Let's not reject this resolution when the needs of people are so great. If we do, it will be an additional responsibility that this Council and the Palestinian people will have to bear. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, in the last few days, the Security Council, and together with it, the entire world, has been witness to the latest, and I'm not afraid to use this word, shameful, cynical, and irresponsible conduct by the United States, which is trying to avoid responsibility for the further use of the veto, resorting to all sorts of means of sabotaging the Security Council's adoption of a decision on Gaza. The world media and public this entire time have been wondering, why is the vote constantly being delayed on the UAE proposed draft, which was already put in blue? The answer is very simple. The United States, under various pretexts, has been dragging out the negotiating process, deviating from the normal, transparent negotiating work. Instead of this, they have resorted to their favoured tactic of gross pressure, blackmail, and twisting arms so that at the last minute they'll be able to present the members of the Council with an ultimatum. Either the Council adopts a text that is convenient for Washington, or the United States will once again block the adoption of any product. The draft that is now being put to a vote was initially, in our view, entirely toothless. But respecting the initiative of our Arab colleagues and their needs, we were ready to support it under pressure from the USA that essentially intercepted the authorship and usurped work on the text behind the scenes at various levels, twisting the hands of those in the region. With each new drafting, the text lost more and more important provisions. Ultimately, the wording that is being put to a vote today has been extremely neutered, including its OP4 on the mechanism that would be supposed to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza and ensure its monitoring. But worse than all of that, through the efforts of the American delegation, the draft resolution has included an extremely dangerous element for the future of Gaza. Instead of the wording on an immediate cessation of violence in OP2, an ambiguous phrase has appeared calling for the parties to create conditions for a cessation of hostilities. Colleagues, destruction or displacement or the exile of the population of Gaza in a cynical reading, and that is precisely how it is going to be read in Israel, would also create the conditions for a cessation of hostilities. By signing off on this, the Council would essentially be giving the Israeli armed forces complete freedom of movement for further clearing of the Gaza Strip, and anyone who votes in favor of the text as it is currently worded would bear responsibility for that, essentially becoming complicit in the destruction of Gaza. Moreover, the text of the draft has lost a reference to condemnations of all indiscriminate attacks on civilians. What signal does this send to the international community? That the Security Council is giving Israel a green light for war crimes? I would like to put a question to members of the Security Council. Why are we together in this room? To rubber stamp a decision that is convenient for Washington, or to shoulder our mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security? We still believe that we're here for the second, for the latter, in order to give the Council a chance to save face and to preserve its battered reputation over the last few days. We propose reverting to the wording from the initial draft in blue on cessation of violence. The Russian Federation proposed the following oral amendment to OP2. Instead of the wording,
and in this regard calls for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered and expanded humanitarian access and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities.
Add the wording.
And in this regard, calls for an urgent suspension of hostilities to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access and for urgent steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities.
That wording was in the text of the draft resolution put in blue by the authors, and that was awaiting a vote. Of course, it is not ideal. You all know very well that Russia from the very beginning has consistently defended the need for an immediate ceasefire. What's more, the parties recently called for that the General Assembly recently called upon the parties to do that in their resolution. However, we are proposing a wording which at the moment is the lowest common denominator for practically all members of the Council. A vote on this amendment can be a moment of truth to show who of the members of the Security Council wants to end violence in Gaza and save the lives of civilians, and who is guided by conjunctural considerations. Colleagues, the way that the text of OP2 is worded currently is the main thing that the USA needs from this resolution. Under a cunning phrase containing the words creating the conditions for a cessation of hostilities, Israel would be given free hand to further non-time limited, entirely unrestrained, indiscriminate bombings of civilian infrastructure and the civilian population of Gaza. We call on delegations to vote in support of what we just proposed and what was initially proposed by the UAE delegation, the language in OP2 on an ending violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. The members of the Council have before them a draft amendment presented by the Russian Federation to the text of the draft resolution that we have in document S/2023/1029. Article 36 of the Provisional Rules of the Council provides for the following. When an amendment leads to an addition or a deletion from a draft resolution, that amendment should be submitted to voting first of all. And therefore, I have the intention to submit the draft amendment to the vote at the beginning. Who is in favour of the draft amendment, please raise your hand.
En contra.
Against? Abstentions? The result of the vote is as follows. 10 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 4 abstentions. The draft amendment has not been approved given the veto of a permanent member of the Security Council. I now understand that the Council is prepared to vote on draft resolution S/2023/.
Previo a esto,
Prior to that, we will give the floor to the United States.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to respond to Russia's rant, a country that has also created conditions that they are complaining about now in their unprovoked war in Ukraine. But colleagues, the United States, as you see, we did not support the amendment put forward by Russia. We believe the humanitarian resolution before us calls for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, and to create the conditions for sustainable cessation of hostilities. This is a strong step forward, and we believe the Council should speak out in the amendments, in the resolution that's been put before us, and move forward with a vote on this resolution. So thank you very much.
agradezco a la...
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. So now we will proceed to the voting. I understand that the Council is ready to vote on the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/1029. I will now submit the draft resolution to the vote. Those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/1029, please raise their hand.
En contra.
Against? Abstentions?
El resultado de la votación.
The result of the vote is as follows. 13 votes in favour, 0 votes against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2720. I will now give the floor to the members of the Council who would like to make a statement after the vote. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, fellow Council colleagues. This was tough, but we got there. Since the start of this conflict, the United States has done work tirelessly to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, to get life-saving assistance into Gaza and to get hostages out of Gaza, to push for the protection of innocent civilians and humanitarian workers, and to work towards a lasting peace. Today's vote bolsters those efforts and lends support to our direct diplomacy. And I want to thank the UAE and others for working with us in good faith to craft a strong humanitarian-focused resolution. It took many days and many long nights of negotiating to get this right. But today, this council provided a glimmer of hope amongst a sea of unimaginable suffering. Today, this council called for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. I'll note that this is the first time this council has used this language we believe is critical to scaling up aid and underscoring the tough steps ahead as we work together to achieve a lasting peace. Colleagues, today this council made clear that addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza needs to remain at the forefront of our agenda. Today this council made clear that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and that humanitarian groups must be able to access hostages, including for medical visits. Today, this council made clear that all parties must respect international humanitarian law. Today, this council made clear that civilian and humanitarian facilities, including hospitals, medical facilities, schools, places of worship, and UN facilities, as well as humanitarian personnel and medical personnel, must be protected. This applies to all parties to this conflict. To Israel, but also to Hamas, a terror group that instigated this conflict and that wages war from inside homes and hospitals and UN sites and uses innocent civilians as human shields, an act of cowardice and cruelty. Colleagues, today this council made clear the need to ensure humanitarian personnel and assistance, including fuel, food, medical supplies, and emergency shelter assistance, can reach people in need. It is hard to overstate how urgent this is. Just yesterday, humanitarian groups released a report on the dire food security crisis in Gaza, and the word famine has started to enter the vocabulary of humanitarian leaders I've met with. Surgeries are being performed without anesthesia. People are huddled in overcrowded UN shelters. Others are sleeping in the streets. This resolution speaks to the severity of this crisis, and it calls on us all to do more. For our part, the United States has worked tirelessly to scale up the delivery of humanitarian aid through direct, persistent presidential diplomacy. In the beginning of this conflict, we helped secure an agreement to open the Rafah crossing. Last month, we helped secure a deal that led to an extended humanitarian pause, during which more than 100 hostages were released and additional aid got into Gaza. And last week, we helped secure the opening of the crossing at Kerem Shalom for direct delivery of assistance to civilians in Gaza. This resolution puts the weight of the Security Council behind these efforts and bolsters them by calling for the appointment of a senior UN official who will work to expedite the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and in a sustained way. We know humanitarians are already doing the impossible, and we are there to do everything in our power to support their life-saving work. It is vital that when implementing this resolution, the UN builds on the progress we have seen on the ground. And we look forward to this new official working with humanitarian actors and relevant parties, including Israel. We know so much more needs to be done to address this humanitarian crisis and to lay the groundwork for a lasting peace. And let's be clear, Hamas has no interest in a lasting peace. Hamas is determined to repeat the horrors of October 7th over and over and over again. And that is why the United States supports Israel's right to protect its people from acts of terror. And I'll note that the resolution does not support any steps that would leave Hamas in power, which in turn would undermine the prospects for a two-state solution, where Gaza and the West Bank are reunited under a single governance structure, under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. We must, colleagues, we must work towards a future where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace. This is the only way forward. Ultimately, while we are encouraged that the Council spoke out on this humanitarian crisis, we're deeply disappointed, appalled actually, that once again, the Council was not able to condemn Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on October 7th. And I can't understand why some Council members are standing in the way and why they refuse to condemn these evils unequivocally. Why is it so hard to condemn Hamas for slaughtering young people at a concert, for burning families alive, for the reports of widespread sexual violence? Why? I will never understand why some Council members have remained silent in the face of such evil. But colleagues, we also believe this Council must continue to put its support behind the resumption of humanitarian pauses. Israel has made clear that it's committed to reaching another agreement. This is now entirely up to Hamas. Hamas must agree to additional pauses. That is how we can get additional aid in and save lives and additional hostages out immediately. Today, this Council spoke out, but we know that only progress on the ground can turn these words into action. So the United States will continue to work with the UN, with humanitarian groups, and countries in the region to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, to secure the release of hostages, and to work towards a lasting peace. There is no time to waste. We must find a path forward to end the misery we're seeing. It's unbearable to see a Palestinian child shivering in fear after their home was destroyed. It's unbearable to see the families of hostages experience such pain and grief as they frantically await and pray for their loved ones to return. My heart is filled with pain, and I know the same is true for so many people around the world. So we must work together to alleviate this tremendous suffering once and for all. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The United Kingdom welcomes the adoption of this resolution to get more aid into Gaza. As my Foreign Secretary has said, it is heartbreaking to see children in the rubble of their destroyed homes, not knowing where to find food or water, not knowing where their parents are. It's also heartbreaking to hear the stories of families who still do not know the whereabouts of their loved ones who were brutally taken on the 7th of October. And it's heart-wrenching to know that aid is piling up outside Gaza but not getting to the people that need it, when we hear daily warnings that people are starving, disease is spreading, and basic health care is lacking. The UK is doing everything we can to get more aid in. We have tripled UK aid to the region. We were the first country to call on Israel to open more crossings. The UK has experts on the ground providing logistical support at Al Arish in Egypt. And today we supported this resolution, which will streamline aid checks so we can massively scale up the humanitarian response. It demands the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and it calls for steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities. And for the avoidance of doubt, we are clear that the resolution is without prejudice to the rights and obligations of parties under international humanitarian law. The adoption is an important signal of the Security Council's commitment. Our actions today and in the future must help ensure that the horror of the 7th of October never happens again. We unequivocally condemn Hamas's acts of terror and support Israel's right to self-defense. My Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been loud and clear in their calls for a sustainable ceasefire as soon as possible. But a ceasefire will not last if Hamas is still able to operate in tunnels and to launch rocket attacks. Our commitment to Israel's security is firm as Israel deals with the threat from Hamas. Ultimately, we support a two-state solution that guarantees true security and stability for both Israeli and Palestinian people. We also thank the UAE for their leadership on this resolution. Just this week, my Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East travelled to Jordan and Egypt to make sure that we are supporting every effort to get aid in faster. And we will keep working with all partners to deliver a humanitarian response that meets the huge level of need. I thank you.
Grazie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil welcomes today's adoption. We thank the United Arab Emirates for tirelessly conducting and facilitating the negotiations, and also for organizing the trip to Rafah, which enabled a first-hand account of the challenging humanitarian work being carried out in the region. This terrible crisis tests our humanity daily. The time for a humanitarian response to the suffering of civilians in Gaza is now, not tomorrow, not when this conflict finally ends. After more than 70 days of hostilities, the situation in Gaza is dire. The remaining hostages must be released immediately. Civilians and civilian facilities must be protected. This is not just a moral or ethical choice, it is an obligation under international humanitarian law, as is humanitarian access. The amount of aid allowed into Gaza must be substantially increased to meet the needs of the people who depend on it throughout Gaza, and should contain all essential items, including fuel. Egypt's efforts to facilitate the use of Rafah crossing by United Nations humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners has been crucial. We welcome the recent announcement by Israel of the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing for the direct delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Brazil calls for the full implementation of the adopted resolutions. Today's resolution provides for a monitoring mechanism for the UN to inspect the delivery of aid. The UN must be provided with the necessary means to carry out this task. The aim is to increase and expedite the entry and delivery of much-needed international assistance. The Council must remain seized of the matter for as long as it takes. And Mr. President, since this is probably our last formal session during our current mandate, I would like to thank all members of this Council for the trust and cooperation with our delegation during these 2 years. I speak on behalf of my entire delegation and of my capital in expressing how much we appreciated working with all of you at different levels and in a vast array of very important topics on the UN agenda of peace and security. We end our term with a sense of accomplishment of the priorities that Brazil always sets when discharging its duties at the UN in general and as a non-permanent member of this Council. We tried our best to engage constructively with all delegations in order to achieve concrete results in this vast and complex agenda of international peace and security in a growingly complex and challenging world. 5 participations of our foreign minister at council meetings in October, in November on the Palestine question illustrate the importance we attach to the Council and to the matters under its consideration. We championed our positions while respecting the diversity of values, opinions, and interests within the Council in order to adequately fulfill our role as a non-permanent member for the 11th time in this body's history. Once again, with President Lula's leadership and personal involvement, Brazil tried hard to make a serious contribution to this collective effort by just being Brazil, the Brazil that is back, a country that talks to every country in the friendliest ways, has no quarrels except with poverty, inequality, and inhumanity and injustice, has an engaged interest in all important matters discussed in the UN, that builds bridges, seeks consensus, acts faithfully as an honest broker, and values and defends peace, the international law, multilateralism, and their synthesis and symbol, the Charter of the United Nations. And most of all, if I may borrow Lincoln's words, a country that acts without malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And if I may add a personal note, I'm most thankful for these 6 months of crash course in multilateral affairs in this worldly classroom. You, dear colleagues, and your teams have all been wonderful teachers to this old bilateralist who hopes to have learned at least some of the multiple skills and statesmanship that you show here every single session. Thank you very much again, and happy holidays. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And Malta thanks the United Arab Emirates for taking the initiative to work on this resolution. I express our appreciation to Ambassador Nusseibeh and her team for their valiant efforts and for organizing the very important trip to Rafah. Malta has consistently expressed grave concern and sought to alleviate the dire humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. Over the past 3 months, this humanitarian crisis has been severely aggravated by the obstruction of adequate emergency humanitarian aid, personnel, and food and water into Gaza. The untenable situation required our urgent attention. This is why we have voted in favour of this text, and we demand for the full implementation of this and Resolution 2712. However, we remain firm in our belief that an immediate ceasefire is the only tangible and realistic measure that can ease the suffering and extreme hardship of the Gazan people. We reiterate that all parties must comply with their obligations under international law, including those regarding the protection of civilians and civilian sites, with accountability for those who violate them. Medical and humanitarian personnel and their assets must be protected to allow the population safety, reprieve, dignity, and in times of acute crisis and anguish. We are already much too late. We welcome the establishment of an aid monitoring mechanism for Gaza as outlined in this resolution. However, its implementation must not add an additional barrier or slow down the principal's delivery of humanitarian assistance. On the contrary, it should rapidly and efficiently facilitate it. We expect that the technical expertise and vast experience of the UN will direct the implementation of this mechanism in coordination with relevant states. Without this, the desperately needed UN humanitarian response will be placed in jeopardy, and the UN and humanitarian staff be placed at great risk. In closing, President, the end of hostilities must also be accompanied with a political urgency to build a durable foundation for peace. We welcome the resolution's clear and unwavering commitment to the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace and security in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, this repeatedly postponed Council vote today has received extensive attention by all. Over the past few days, in order to maximize consensus, the UAE delegation made tireless efforts and resubmitted the draft resolution late last night. We welcome the adoption of this draft resolution that was put to vote just now. For reasons known to all, this draft resolution has made quite a number of adjustments in some important aspects, and these adjustments are not consistent with the efforts we made and do not meet our expectations. At the same time, given the urgency of the situation on the ground and given the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that is getting more dire by the day, the Council's present action offers at least a glimmer of hope for more and faster delivery of humanitarian supplies to Gaza. Of course, whether this glimmer of hope can be truly felt by the people of Gaza in the midst of this disaster also depends on whether the resolution can be effectively implemented and whether the relevant provisions of the resolution can be carried out without compromise. We expect urgent actions to be taken pursuant to this Council resolution to expand humanitarian assistance to Gaza, including by making full use of the Kerem Shalom crossing and the opening of additional crossings to ensure the safe and unimpeded entry of sufficient humanitarian supplies into Gaza. We hope that the monitoring mechanism newly provided for in the resolution will be put in place as soon as possible. We look forward to SG's timely reporting to the Council on the implementation of this resolution. The Council should stand ready to take further actions at any time to resolve the problems and difficulties encountered in the implementation of the resolution. The resolution reaffirms that all parties to the conflict should comply with the obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We urge Israel to immediately reverse its course, cease its indiscriminate military attacks, and stop its collective punishment of the population of Gaza. As the occupying power, Israel has an obligation to safeguard the humanitarian needs for the population of Gaza and to guarantee the safety of humanitarian workers in Gaza. Mr. President, it should be observed that the realization of a ceasefire remains the overriding prerequisite. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater casualties of civilians, including hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the regional conflict from spiraling out of control, and only a ceasefire can prevent the prospects for a political settlement from being completely destroyed. This is the reason why we voted in favor of Russia's amendment. We also regret that this amendment was vetoed. Going forward, China would like to work with all Council members to promote further responsible and meaningful action by the Council in a timely manner, and to continue to make unremitting efforts to bring an end to the fighting in Gaza, to effectively implement the two-state solution, and to realize peace and stability in the Middle East at an early date. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. The catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza needs urgent attention and meaningful action by this Council. Thus, we are deeply grateful for the UAE and our friends in the Arab group for their constructive engagement with all Council members to this end. Japan voted in favor of this resolution. Given the deepening humanitarian crisis, it is indispensable to immediately scale up emergency assistance to and throughout Gaza. There is no safe place for the people in Gaza, and they cannot wait any longer for the Council to act. We also demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Therefore, we are pleased that the Council finally adopted another resolution today to address urgent humanitarian needs in Gaza, and we hope this will be a first step towards real change on the ground. Mr. President, full-fledged but sensitive diplomacy is underway to further scale up emergency humanitarian assistance to Gaza. In this vein, we highly appreciate the serious diplomatic efforts that the United States has been conducting in the region to improve the situation on the ground. The entry of humanitarian convoys into Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing is one of the results of these efforts, but more needs to be done. Japan, as a responsible member of the Security Council, remains committed to addressing the devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Even now, gunfire and bombardment continue, and this must stop immediately for a period that allows for meaningful humanitarian operation to aid those who are enduring this grave humanitarian catastrophe and suffering. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. Thank you, Mr. President. Switzerland voted in favour of the resolution, and we welcome its adoption. I would like to thank the delegation of the United Arab Emirates and all colleagues, members of the Council, but also from the region, for their tireless efforts to find a compromise in order to alleviate the disastrous humanitarian situation existing in the Gaza Strip. It's essential that this Council speak to protect civilians. The images of the Rafah crossing clearly show this. The civilian population is desperate. It needs the immediate support of the international community to survive. If this compromise, because of its nature, is below many expectations, this resolution, as well as the opening up of Kerem Shalom crossing, is a contribution to help. The resolution provides for a post of humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator to establish a UN mechanism that will provide all the necessary flexibility to rationalize and improve the effectiveness of procedures and ensure that humanitarian aid is able to reach people that need it as soon as possible. Switzerland welcomes the agreement found in the Council that should contribute to an effective implementation of humanitarian aid on the ground to save lives. And also, in order to provide rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access, the resolution calls for the conditions to be created for a lasting ceasefire that does not prejudice Israel's right to defend its security. It should make it possible to ensure the unconditional immediate release of all hostages that have been held since the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October last that Switzerland firmly condemned. The resolution today is complementary to international humanitarian law, according to which all parties to a conflict, as well as non-warring parties, have the obligation to authorize and facilitate rescue operations aimed to help the population in need. Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We commend the UAE, ASPAN holder, and others involved from the region and from outside for the tremendous efforts to come with the text we just adopted. We welcome the adoption of this important resolution and consider it as an important step forward in dealing with the urgency of the dire situation in Gaza. We would have liked a more robust text, including on some important key issues that are missing there. But the text has clear merits which guided our position, and we welcome the establishment of a clear and straightforward mechanism to allow unhindered access for humanitarian assistance at scale to the population in Gaza and make a real difference on the ground. People in Gaza are going hungry. They need assistance. Countless families are in dire need. They must be helped now, today, and every day. Therefore, it is urgent for the UN to step up. And this is all this resolution provides for: urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access at scale, and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, we call for and look forward to the speedy and full implementation of this resolution. But we want to be clear: we support the cessation of hostilities with the aim to save civilians, to help innocent Palestinians rebuild their lives. All those who are trapped in a bloody conflict, children, women, entire families, everyone who doesn't deserve to suffer or die. Therefore, our vote in favor cannot and must not be seen, understood, or misused by Hamas in any way or any circumstance, directly or indirectly, as condoning the unacceptable and the unjustifiable, and for them to continue to use what belongs to and should go only to the people of Gaza to plan and attack Israel and its population, as they've been doing since October 7th. All Palestinians must unite under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, pursue the path of peace and negotiations, and use all political means in order to build their future, have their state, and ensure their freedom and dignity, together and along with Israel living in security. It is a clear position we have expressed repeatedly during the last 2 years, and is one of the key wishes and hopes we will keep with us as we exit the Security Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. President. France thanks the United Arab Emirates for preparing this resolution and would like to thank them for their efforts throughout the negotiating process. France welcomes the adoption today of a resolution that allows us to respond to the humanitarian emergency on the ground and improve the delivery of aid to Gaza at a time when the humanitarian crisis is worsening day by day. Yesterday, we all saw the reports of a serious risk of famine in Gaza, and the Secretary General raised the alarm over the humanitarian tragedy currently underway in Gaza. It is urgent that more humanitarian assistance be delivered to the civilian population of Gaza that need it more than ever. This resolution calls for urgent steps to be taken to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. We would have preferred the Council to be able to speak more ambitiously on this subject. Since the beginning of the conflict, France has been pleading for an immediate, durable humanitarian truce that should lead to a lasting ceasefire. Like Resolution 2712, today's resolution once again calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. These resolutions must be immediately respected and implemented, as international law more broadly must also be. This resolution is also along the lines of France's efforts to mobilize the international community in the face of the scale of the crisis, as we did during the International Humanitarian Conference organized on the 9th of November, which allowed us to gather more than €1 billion in promised donations. For these reasons, France voted in favor of this resolution. The President of the Republic and the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs visited the region in recent days. In Jordan yesterday, the President of the Republic supported the creation of a humanitarian platform and recalled the crucial importance of working immediately on a ceasefire. Only a ceasefire will allow for the reopening of a necessary political horizon. France recalls that international humanitarian law must be applied in all circumstances and that it must be possible to guarantee complete, safe, unhindered access for humanitarian workers, and humanitarian personnel as well as medical and hospital staff must be protected. This text must be applied in full. Mr. President, this Council must also condemn in the strongest terms the terrorist attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October, including sexual violence that they used to dehumanize and terrorize their victims. It is incomprehensible that this Council has still not been able to do so. It should do so, must do so, and law and morality require it. France will continue to work resolutely within the full and complete mobilization of this Council on every aspect of the crisis, security, humanitarian and political. France recalls the urgent need to better protect the lives of Palestinian civilians and to contribute to a rapid end to the crisis based on the two-state solution, which is the only thing that can allow for the construction of a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I wish to begin by expressing our sincere appreciation to the United Arab Emirates for the tireless work made that led to the adoption of this resolution, which aims to respond to a humanitarian catastrophe currently unfolding in Gaza. Mozambique's vote in favor of the resolution reflects our strong commitment to the principle of protection of civilians currently in Gaza or during any armed conflict. We are mindful of the fact that this resolution is not a perfect test, but it clearly states the basic principles that must guide the parties and ought to be upheld by the world at large. As the Secretary General says and the international law asserts, even wars have laws that must be observed. In this connection, the resolution emphasized the importance of international humanitarian law and humanitarian access. It is an effort to respond to the critical role of humanitarian personnel. I repeat, it is an effort to respond to the critical role of humanitarian personnel in providing aid to civilians affected by the conflict. Mozambique's position is aligned with the global effort to safeguard civilians and uphold their rights during times of conflict. Together with other members of the Security Council, in our national capacity, we have been to Rafah Hospital, to the Rafah crossing border. We could see with our own eyes and feel with our own hearts the tragedy that has befallen the Palestinian people. We therefore strongly believe that this resolution is an important step towards alleviating the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. The civilians in Gaza need enough food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunication, and medical service for their immediate survival. By voting in favor, we emphasize the critical need for urgent humanitarian aid to reach civilians in Gaza during this ongoing conflict. The situation is dire, and immediate action is necessary to prevent further humanitarian suffering. We reiterate the urgency of this demand to the parties in conflict to allow and facilitate access by all possible means and forms of humanitarian aid to the civilians in Gaza. This resolution is also crucial to operationalize implementation of Resolution 2712. However, the best alternative for peace to prevail in Gaza Strip remains a durable and sustained cessation of hostilities and a return to a constructive dialogue between the parties. Mr. President, we reiterate Mozambique's call for dialogue between Israel and Palestine. In the midst of long-standing tensions, open communication remains essential for a negotiated settlement of conflicts. We hope that both parties will heed this call and work towards a constructive dialogue that can pave the way for understanding and reconciliation. We strongly believe that the Palestinian people and the Israeli people can live and coexist side by side in security and peace, in fulfillment of numerous decisions and resolution of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, let me begin by commending the UAE for all the efforts they've put into this resolution to enable the Council obtain an outcome that we hope would scale up the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. While we believe it is time for hostilities to end and for dialogue and diplomacy to be given its chance, Ghana voted in favor of Resolution 2720 because with so many lives lost, mostly women and children, and many more on the verge of starvation, famine, and pestilence, it is imperative that we take every opportunity that can help save lives, facilitate humanitarian access and delivery to the millions of civilians in Gaza, and address the deteriorating humanitarian conditions on the ground. As the resolution we have adopted rightly emphasizes, all parties to the conflict have an obligation to comply with international law, in particular as it impacts the protection of civilians and their well-being. The need to fully respect United Nations premises and its personnel and assets cannot also be overemphasized. We welcome the decision to open the Karem Salem border crossings to enhance the delivery of humanitarian assistance and urge the easing of all rigid procedures to speed up the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We also reiterate the call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Mr. President, as this would be Ghana's final remarks on this subject during our present membership of the Security Council, we urge the Council not to lose sight of its historical responsibility for the implementation of the two-state solution, even in this most darkest of moments. We believe, as we have often stated, that the two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as the shared capital is the key to the resolution of the instability in the Middle East. In this regard, the renewal of the political horizon should be a commitment that the Council should not waver from. Finally, we express the hope that the implementation of the resolution just adopted will be done in good faith to save human lives in both the Gaza Strip and Israel, and see the appointment by the Secretary General of a representative in this regard as important. May the coming year open new paths of opportunity to resolve this decades-long conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, earlier when I introduced our amendment, I said that the vote on it would be a moment of truth. And that's what happened. The United States once again exposed their true face in front of the entire world, blocking an even extremely weak call on the part of the Council for a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. Instead of that, Washington is playing an extremely underhanded game, forcing into the text an essential license for Israel to kill Palestinian civilians in Gaza under the pretext, and I quote, of creating conditions for a cessation of hostilities. Today at the briefing, the coordinator on strategic communications of the National Security Council of the White House, John Kirby, said that the Israeli authorities understand the need to lower the intensity of the fighting in the Gaza Strip. It's up to them to take the decision about the timeline of when that would take place. Colleagues, this is a tragic moment for the Council, not a moment of the triumph of multilateral diplomacy, but rather one of a gross, unprincipled blackmail and open scorn on the part of Washington for the suffering of Palestinians and the hopes of the global community to put an end to all of this. Today, the permanent representative of the USA spoke about the direct bilateral diplomacy of Washington at a high level. Previously, we've heard this argument, and we can see what it has led to. The Security Council essentially is being asked not to get in the way while the United States goes around twisting arms in the region, not for the sake of peace, as my American colleague asserts, but for the sake of ensuring the mercantile short-term interests of Washington. Colleagues, if this document weren't supported by a number of Arab states, we would, of course, have vetoed it. At the same time, we also note that a number of the co-sponsors, including Arab states, withdrew their co-sponsorship. But we consistently are of the view that the Arab world is itself able to take decisions and bear full responsibility for them. This is the only reason why we did not block this document. But I want to once again underscore, we categorically do not agree with the content of the current OP2, and we are of the view that responsibility for all possible consequences lies with those states that gave their consent to its wording that was forced through by the United States. We will not put our names to this. Distinguished colleagues, regardless of the outcomes of today's vote, a clear demand by the Security Council for a full-fledged ceasefire remains the imperative. Without that, as the experience of Security Council Resolution 2712 has already shown, implementing the Security Council's resolutions in Gaza is simply impossible. On the 8th of December, during his statement in the Council, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, unambiguously stated this, and the same conclusion emerges from his letter to the Council with options for monitoring Resolution 2712. We are of the view that whatever the resistance may be and however much they might protect their main ally in the United States, in the region by the United States, the Council will get back to this issue and precisely and unambiguously demand a cessation of hostilities. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, for the record, I'd like to state that the draft resolution that was put in blue on Friday evening did receive 83 co-sponsors from this membership, but that this resolution was not open for co-sponsorship due to the last-minute nature of the negotiations and due to the fact that it was put in blue only this morning. So no one withdrew from their co-sponsorship. It hasn't been open to co-sponsorship, but I'm sure it would receive widespread support if it had. I'd like to reflect on the vote we just held and what it says, though, about this conflict and this body. We welcome its adoption, and we're grateful for this Council's support. We believe that the resolution begins to unblock life-saving aid whose denial has condemned more than 500,000 people in Gaza to famine. The text compels the international community to finally share in the burden that Egypt has been shouldering, and it commits all of us to breaking the cruel blockade strangling Gaza for the last 16 years. But the Palestinian struggle is singular in how every instance of progress serves as a reminder of the scale of the tragedy. It is not lost on us that while today we start building a humanitarian architecture that responds to an intolerable situation, we are still unable to stop the war. It is not lost on us that despite the incalculable damage visited upon them with impunity, Palestinians are asked to accept that diplomacy is the art of what is possible. It is not lost on us that even though what has been possible has been brutally inadequate, they have kept faith with this international system. But what is possible is not predetermined. It is the product of active choices. The collective choices of this Council, influenced by its structure, have shaped this grim reality. They can help shape a different future. Doing that must begin by understanding that 30 years after they recognize the State of Israel, there is very little left for the Palestinians to concede. The injustice of the occupation persists with the international community's complicity. If you have a moral, national, or political interest in saving the two-state solution, you must act now. This resolution gives us an opportunity to demonstrate that at the very least, the world will not tolerate the continued deprivation of the people of Gaza from basic necessities. It puts in place a system that is necessary now and that will remain necessary when the war ends. We are all responsible for making sure that it works. Mr. President, we thank each and every Council member for their dedication and support to this process, including the E10 for their steadfast unity on this file. And I'd like to thank the United States again and the United Kingdom for their important, constructive diplomatic work behind the scenes on this. I'd also like to thank the Ecuadorian presidency for their patience and wisdom in enabling this adoption despite really challenging negotiations. And to the United States, I'd like to thank Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, whose personal dedication and commitment to help save lives made today possible. This outcome will enable life-saving humanitarian assistance to get into Gaza and reach those in need. It will quite literally make the difference between life and death for hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians. It is vital that this Council lives up to its responsibility by ensuring its full implementation. But as we help save lives here in Gaza, so too we must focus here on restoring the hope in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today's resolution is an important step on the long journey ahead. Any lasting and comprehensive solution demands an end to the war in Gaza, addressing the dramatic situation of those internally displaced, uniting Gaza and the West Bank under a single, legitimate, and representative Palestinian authority, reconstructing what has been destroyed, and ensuring that never again shall violence, incitement, and terror be allowed to thrive. None of this will be sustainable if there is no equality between Israelis and Palestinians in charting their shared destiny together. It can never be a just peace if equality and dignity are not the basis of it. This resolution gives us a signal of that political horizon ahead. The two-state solution with an independent and sovereign Palestinian state is the only path to achieving a just peace that guarantees security, stability, and prosperity for the Palestinian and Israeli people alike, who both have a right to statehood in their ancestral land. The UAE will never tire in its pursuit of that goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Ecuador. The Council has voted in favour of the draft that we have been considering. This was the outcome of careful negotiations, and this shows the good faith and the constructive spirit that can achieve this. We very much appreciate the willingness shown by all members, and we hope that this will be repeated in other matters. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is disastrous, a despairing situation. During our visit last week, we saw so many people suffering, and the alleviation of their suffering must be our priority. The aid that has reached Gaza is not sufficient for the civilian population. The text that we have voted aims to significantly increase the quantity of aid and calls for the necessary steps to be taken to make this possible. In this regard, it calls for an increase in the access and to optimize the inspection processes. For Ecuador, it is of vital importance that humanitarian aid be delivered in sufficient quantities and that there be adequate inspections to ensure that those inspections are reliable. This resolution in no way contravenes the previous resolution 2712 and should be seen as an additional step towards the urgent need for a ceasefire. Excellencies, in this text, the Council deplores the violations of international humanitarian law, violence against civilians, and acts of terrorism, and it also demands the unconditional immediate release of all hostages. It couldn't be otherwise. Ecuador repeats our robust condemnation of the acts committed by Hamas on the 7th of October, and we believe that the text could have clearly mentioned the fact that the hostages are in the hands of Hamas and other groups. But you cannot always get a perfect text, and the important thing is the humanitarian aspect here. And it's also very important that at times such as these, the text reiterates the commitment of this Council to the two-state solution, and Ecuador is convinced that this is the only path towards peace and security in the area. And we hope that this resolution can be implemented urgently given the situation and will effectively contribute to alleviating the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I'd like to congratulate the United Arab Emirates delegation, which this month is ending their membership of the Council, and we are very happy to see that this resolution was approved under our presidency. Ecuador has tried to be a responsible presidency, and President Noboa and Foreign Minister have visited New York and tried to create bridges that made this kind of thing possible that we've seen today. I'd also like to thank all outgoing members, Albania, Brazil, the United Arab Emirates, Gabon, and Ghana, for their tireless contributions to our work in the last 2 years. And now I resume my functions as President of the Council. I give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, this conflict first met to address this Council first met to address this grave crisis when hundreds of Palestinians had been killed by Israel, the occupying power, in its siege and aggression on the Gaza Strip. The Council is now meeting after over 20,000 Palestinians have been killed, almost half of them children, and 60,000 people have been wounded, and 2 million Palestinians have been forcefully displaced. It is meeting as homes, shelters, schools, hospitals have been destroyed, and as hunger and disease are spreading like wildfire. No one should forget that what we are talking about are 2.3 million Palestinians who have been fighting for their life and facing death every single day for 75 days. They have been fighting for their lives, for their very existence, for over 75 days. Mr. President, the Arab and the OIC groups, with the support of an overwhelming number of UN member states, have been mobilizing for 3 objectives, and we said that from the beginning. End the carnage immediately, immediate ceasefire, humanitarian assistance at scale, and no forced displacement. We meet today as part of this continuous effort to advance these 3 goals. Mr. President, allow me at the onset to pay tribute to all the humanitarian and health care workers who, at peril to their own lives, are struggling every single day to address and alleviate an occupation-made humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale. They are operating under conditions where no place and no one is safe, under widespread and indiscriminate bombing, where hospitals and shelters and ambulances are shelled, and with minimal to no access to humanitarian supplies necessary to sustain and save lives. We pay tribute to the Palestine Red Crescent, in which many of you have met them in your trip to the Rafah crossing, to Palestinian medical and civilian rescue teams, to the personnel of the United Nations and its agencies, notably UNRWA, to the members of Palestinian and international humanitarian organizations on the ground, and to the ICRC. Their work is heroic and deserves our utmost recognition and respect. The draft resolution presented by the United Arab Emirates is to allow them to conduct their sacred mission to assist civilians in need to save human lives as Israel, the occupying power, continues to ignore the global demands for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and to deprive the Palestinian people of the humanitarian aid they desperately need. There are thousands of trucks of humanitarian aid on the Egyptian side, and Egypt's full willingness and mobilization to see this aid delivered. You saw those thousands of truckloads from your trip from Al Arish Airport to the Rafah crossing. There are over 2 million Palestinians in desperate need of such aid on the Palestinian side. This inhumane and criminal Israeli siege, this use of humanitarian aid necessary for the survival of the population as method of war has to end, and it has to end now. Mr. President, on 4th of November, the deputy head of the Israeli civil administration stated from inside Gaza, and I quote, whoever returns here, if they return here after, will find scorched earth, no houses, no agriculture, no nothing. They have no future. End of quotation. This is just one statement among far too many, demonstrating in shocking terms that what we are dealing with is an attempt at the destruction of our people and their displacement forever from their land. This is Israel's goal, its true objective. No future for Palestinians in Palestine. That is why it is bombing everyone and everything. That is why it targets homes, hospitals, schools, bakeries, agricultural fields, water and sanitation networks, so that sustenance of life becomes impossible, and it has become impossible. That is why it targets the landmarks of Gaza, which stand witness of its ancient history and of our roots in the land, our historic churches and mosques, our monuments and our architecture. Israel also targets the storytellers, those who capture our people's lives, suffering and death, including the journalists conveying to the world the truth about the massacres, about this grave and unbearable injustice being endured by Palestinian people and their families. But Israel's target is not only the past and the present of our people, but indeed the future. That is why it kills our doctors, engineers, poets, academics, artists. This is why it is destroying our cities and towns, our universities and cultural institutions. That is why it kills our children and terrorizes and traumatizes them, scaring and disfiguring their futures. We often quote the number of children killed, an unbearable tragedy, but we should not forget the 25,000 children orphaned and the tens of thousands wounded and amputated. A 12-year-old Palestinian girl with the most beautiful of names, Dunya, which means dunya in Arabic, it means the whole world. Lost both her parents, her sister, and her brother, all killed in Israelis shelling of her house. She also lost her leg, and I believe she was interviewed by the CNN journalist that United Arab Emirates managed to let her enter the Gaza Strip and to make that important report that she did. And Donia said that while she will never forget her loved ones, she has to continue living, that she would become a doctor to help children as doctors helped her. But Dunya did not live to become a doctor or to memorialize her family. She was killed a few days later in the strike in the maternity ward of Al-Nasr Hospital. Israel wants to convince us that we need to choose between life and our country by making life in our country impossible. Our people want to live in their country. They want their children to grow safely in their country. There is no simpler dream, there is no aspiration more sacred than that. Mr. President, Israel's treatment of Palestinian civilians and its abhorrent crimes against them were further starkly revealed after Israel killed 3 people raising a white flag and representing no danger. It later discovered that they were 3 Israelis who had been held captive in Gaza. It could have saved them had it observed the laws of war, but it thought they were Palestinians and shot them. And yet, another display of total abject disregard for Palestinian lives. This confirms the many reports of summary executions of Palestinians being murdered in cold blood by Israeli soldiers in Gaza. Israel has also continued its ill treatment and mass arrest and humiliation of Palestinians in despicable scenes filmed by its own soldiers, boasting about their depravity. Those are the soldiers of a ragu army, unhinged and empowered by the impunity it enjoys, certain that it will not be held accountable, an army that commits atrocities every single day. In the words of Israel's closest allies, its indiscriminate bombing and its killing rage needs to stop. That means its crimes need to stop. Gaza is like a patient whose wounds you are trying to treat while the killer keeps shooting at them. You need to stop the killer, or you will never be able to save the patient. Mr. President, death is everywhere in Gaza, in its different manifestations: destruction, deprivation, disease. People are starving. They have no water, no food, no medicine, or barely any. The draft resolution that the Council voted on today is intended to help address this inhumane situation, to alleviate the untold suffering and pain being borne by millions of civilians. We welcome the decision to establish a UN mechanisms to accelerate the provision of humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza and call for its rapid implementation. The Council also called for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access. The Secretary General and all UN agencies, as well as humanitarian organizations, have all said that this requires an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, now backed by 153 states around the world. It took this Council 75 days to finally utter the word cessation of hostilities. To utter the word cessation of hostilities. 40 days after the General Assembly first referred to that objective and tens of thousands of Palestinians killed later. We support the Russian amendment, and the United Arab Emirates, as Arab representative, reflected that support in its vote. Of course, that paragraph, which was endorsed in the blue form, the original one, by the 83 co-sponsors. The resolution is also clear about the unwavering commitment to the two-state solution consistent with international law and UN resolutions, and in this context, on the status of the Gaza Strip as an integral part of the territory occupied in 1967 and as part of the Palestinian state, and on the unity of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the role of the Palestinian Authority, and the complete rejection of forced displacement in violation of international law. Mr. President, let us act now to save lives, to provide life-saving assistance and life-sustaining hope. This resolution is a step in the right direction. It must be implemented and must be accompanied by massive pressure for an immediate ceasefire. I repeat, immediate ceasefire. There is no way to stop the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide underway, but an immediate ceasefire. Ceasefire again. There is no way to start addressing the occupation-made humanitarian catastrophe, but an immediate ceasefire. Ceasefire again. There is no way to release those held captive, but an immediate ceasefire. This resolution calls for protection of civilians, deplores attacks against civilians, rejects forced displacement, calls for immediate and safe humanitarian access, and for humanitarian aid reaching the Palestinian population. All that requires an immediate ceasefire. Immediate ceasefire, as requested and as called for by the Secretary General in his famous letter to the Security Council. Humanity must prevail. International law must prevail. Millions of lives hang in the balance. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a week ago, Jaish al-Adl carried out a terror attack in Iran in which 11 Iranian police officers were killed. Within one day, the Security Council released a statement condemning the act of terror. It took the Security Council one day to express their condolences and sympathy with the families of the victims. It's true, terrorism must be condemned, even if the attacks are perpetrated against police officers of a rogue regime and the world's leading sponsor of global terror. Mr. President, 77 days ago, Hamas intentionally murdered, raped, and mutilated 1,300 Israelis and took 250 hostages, and this Council still has yet to issue a single statement condemning Hamas and their atrocities. In addition to the Council's inability to condemn Hamas's attack, the 130 hostages, women, children, and the elderly are still being held in Gaza and must not be allowed to become a footnote. Humanitarian aid is pouring into Gaza every single day Yet the hostages being held by Hamas are not even allowed visits by the Red Cross. This is the most heinous war crime imaginable. The hostages must be at the top of this Council's agenda. Council members, there is no doubt that humanitarian aid is crucially important. Israel is already facilitating hundreds of truckloads of aid into Gaza every day. Israel is also willing and able to exponentially increase the entry of aid trucks into Gaza. Israel has already opened the Kerem Shalom crossing in order to ensure the entry of more trucks, and has also facilitated the entry of dozens of trucks that arrived from Jordan. The only roadblock for aid entry is the UN's ability to accept them. Enhancing UN monitoring or coordination of aid is not a cure-all, and any enhancement of UN aid monitoring cannot be done at the expense of Israel's security inspections. Israel not only has a right but an obligation to guarantee its security. This is why our mission to eliminate Hamas's capabilities has not changed, and this is why security inspections of aid will not change. Israel will not permit the regrouping and rearming of Hamas, as the atrocities of October 7th can never be allowed to repeat themselves. Israel recently exposed another huge Hamas terror tunnel that stretches 4 kilometers, was constructed 50 meters underground. This terror tunnel is wide enough for vehicles to drive through. It can house hundreds of terrorists. The amount of cement and equipment needed to build this tunnel alone is immense. This is just one part of Hamas's subterranean city of terror, the missile and rocket manufacturing facilities, and terrorist training complexes across Gaza. It cannot be claimed that Israel did not give any warning. For years, we have sent letters outlining Hamas's terror threat and growing capabilities. We have held countless meetings with officials. We have done everything possible to make it clear that action must be taken. But our words fell on deaf ears. Mr. President, if this Council seeks to end hostilities, it should start by supporting Israel's mission of returning the hostages and eliminating the Hamas threat, and at the very least, it must prevent Hamas's empowerment. Just as this Council is committed to increasing aid, it should also be committed to blocking the smuggling of arms and transfer of weapons to the Hamas terrorists. And just as this Council is committed to ensuring aid reaches Gazan civilians, it should also be committed to ensuring the said aid is not diverted into Hamas terrorists who do not care about the civilian population. The focus of any resolution should also hold Hamas accountable while taking every step to prevent them from entrenching themselves and regaining power. Mr. President, Hamas is a genocidal terror organization. Hamas is a direct threat to the security of Israel, to Gazans, and regional stability. In order to promote security, this Council should first recognize Hamas's terror regime and then focus on the elimination of its threats. It should be focused on freeing the hostages. It should be focused on preventing Hamas from exploiting aid. It should be focused on ensuring Hamas can no longer expand their terror infrastructure. Any resolution adopted by this Council should be focused primarily on these points, and this is the Council's responsibility, and this is key to security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس متحدث.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Egypt, I congratulate you on the success of the Security Council in adopting today an important resolution that will facilitate the delivery of human aid to Gaza. As the Secretary General will assign a humanitarian affairs coordinator who will facilitate and coordinate the aid and will establish a mechanism, UN humanitarian mechanism, to work inside Gaza under the UN to address the horrific humanitarian crisis endured by the people in the Gaza Strip for the third month consecutively as a result of the lethal, devastating war by Israel on the defenseless people of Palestine. I would also like to thank the UAE and its submission to the UN for its relentless, sincere efforts in its intensive consultations with members of the Security Council and UN agencies that led to the adoption of this resolution. And we thank the UAE for ensuring success of this adoption. Mr. President, the adoption of today's resolution builds on the previous comprehensive resolution submitted by the Arab and Islamic groups, co-sponsored by 81 states, in implementation of the decision of the Special Islamic Arab Summit in Riyadh held on November last, related to lifting the humanitarian blockade imposed on our brothers in Gaza. Today's resolution is a step on the right way to address the humanitarian impact of this war in Gaza and ensure that aid will be delivered unhindered through a mechanism under the supervision by the UN. So the humanitarian work will not remain hostage to the will of the occupying power, the power that cannot be perceived legally or reasonably as a neutral party when it comes to the delivery of humanitarian support. Mr. President, we are looking forward for this resolution to support the efforts of the international community to provide aid to Gaza. Gaza Strip that is witnessing a horrific humanitarian crisis unprecedented since World War II. The crisis that led to the killing of more than 20,000, most of them, 70% of them are women and children, and more than 53 injured. Gaza is starving. Houses are destroyed. Hospitals and the medical facilities are destroyed. This is accompanied by the attacks by Israel on the West Bank, causing casualties. That's in addition to the continued attacks by settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which might lead to a spiral of violence in Palestine. Mr. President, Egypt expresses its thanks and appreciation to the Secretary General. We thank him again for his efforts over the past period and continuous calls for humanitarian ceasefire. We thank him for calling the attention of the Security Council to the threat to international peace and security posed by the situation in Gaza. We thank him for the letter he addressed to the Security Council invoking Article 99. We also express our appreciation to the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini. We pay tribute to all the staff on UNRWA, first for the sacrifices made by UNRWA and the efforts it made in the hardest conditions in Gaza, and also for the Commissioner General who addressed the General Assembly highlighting the collapse of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. This bolstered our pursuits and endeavors to submit the draft resolution to support humanitarian efforts. Mr. President, now that the Security Council has adopted a resolution we look forward to the agencies and bodies of the UN to implement it without delay and immediately. Agencies should make concerted efforts to draw up a comprehensive plan that will translate this resolution into a functioning and effective mechanism in full coordination with the international community. This is a first step that should be followed by other steps. First of which is to oblige Israel, the occupying power, to immediately cease fire and halt hostilities, all hostilities, without any condition in all parts of Gaza. All efforts that aim at alleviating the humanitarian crisis and supporting the humanitarian condition will bear fruit only when the Security Council implements a binding resolution on comprehensive and lasting ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities throughout Gaza without any condition, and to end the killing of civilians and allow for humanitarian work and provide protection and security to humanitarian workers. This demand for comprehensive ceasefire is a response to the will of the international community, that will that is expressed on many occasions, the last of which was the resolution adopted in the General Assembly in its 10th emergency special session on December 12th that called for humanitarian ceasefire. The resolution garnered 153 votes in favor, which reflects a global consensus that cannot be argued that the resolution is not binding politically or legally. Mr. President, we stress that the draft resolution adopted today has not been confined to humanitarian aspects only. It has focused on other items that should be implemented. It stressed that obligations under international law should be respected. Civilians should be protected. Humanitarian workers should be protected. Relief trucks should be protected. Civilians should not be forcibly transferred. The resolution also stressed that the unity of the Palestinian territory in Gaza Strip and the West Bank under a national Palestinian Authority should be respected. These are all not any less important than the humanitarian aspect. In this connection, Egypt reiterates the importance of creating a political prospect and resume the negotiations that realizes the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people in establishing its independent state along the June 4th, 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is the only path to ensure achieving comprehensive and just peace in the region and ensure security and stability for the peoples of the region. Mr. President, your success today gives a glimmer of hope. Though dim, yet it should be upheld and should be built upon to put an end to the horrific humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We call upon you to make all concerted efforts to put an end to the war and end the massive suffering endured by the defenseless Palestinian people for 3 months. Mr. President, we call upon you to make efforts to end the bloodshed of the innocent people and to save the lives of innocent people. These are the most noble goals of the Security Council and the UN at large. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before adjourning the meeting, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of December, I would like to express the sincere appreciation of the delegation of Ecuador to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat of the Council for all the support they have given us. Indeed, it has been a busy month and one in which we rallied to consensus on several important issues within our purview. We could not have done it alone, and without the hard work, support and positive contributions of every delegation and the representatives of the Secretariat, including the technical support team, conference service officers, interpreters, translators, verbatim reporters and security staff. As we end our presidency, as it draws to a close, I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of France good luck in the month of January. On behalf of the Council, I'd also like to express sincere thanks of the Council to the 5 outgoing members, Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana and the United Arab Emirates. I commend their hard work and contributions during their terms on the Security Council. The meeting is adjourned.